Good morning, everybody. Exodus chapter 20, verse 8, starting in the Sabbath, commandment number 4. Remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. So, I don't know where to start off with all this, but there's some interesting stuff involved for sure. So when we're looking at the fourth commandment, the first fact that's probably the most important one, well, there's two. Which one's more important? I'm going to flip a coin or something. I'm going to flip this pen. We'll determine which one's more important. This is how you actually, scholars, how they determine doctrine. I didn't actually decide which way the pen was supposed to flip, so that didn't help me. Okay, two quick facts, both very important. Number one, notice as it says, for in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and the earth. The Sabbath was established at creation, not at Mount Sinai. So it's worth noting that we had already read about the manna and how the manna wasn't going to be there on the seventh day. Sabbath was established at creation. Now, the laws of how to follow Sabbath, the fourth commandment on keeping Sabbath, that wasn't established at creation. That was established here at Mount Sinai. But what day is Sabbath? I bring that up because many Christians throughout the ages, including like Charles Spurgeon and others, I mean, this is not something that we need to fight over. It's not a big deal. But oftentimes, Sundays are referred to as the Sabbath. As we unpack this, you can choose to Sabbath, to rest on Sundays. But Sundays will never be the Sabbath. The Sabbath will always be Saturday, from sundown on Friday to sundown on Saturday. It's established at creation. That doesn't change. And so oftentimes we hear reference to the Lord's Day. And that's what we see Acts chapter 20, verse 7, 1 Corinthians 16, 2. We see them at the first day of the week gathering together. Revelation chapter 1, verse 10, John is in the Spirit on the Lord's Day. So we see reference to the Lord's Day, and the early church gathered together on the first day of the week. Well, I don't know when we're going to get to what. I don't plan these out very well, but the Lord's Day. So the first day of the week traditionally was called the Lord's Day because it's the day that the Lord Jesus resurrected. And the early church met on the Lord's Day, on Sundays, but they didn't call it the Sabbath. Down the road, people started calling Sundays Sabbath. It's the Christian day of rest. But we don't call Fridays like the Muslim Sabbath, because Fridays are the day of worship for Muslims, right? But the idea is that, firstly, that the Sabbath is Saturdays. I don't split hairs with people. If we're just talking, I know what they're meaning if they refer to Sunday as a Sabbath, and there's no need to correct them. But if we're going to have a Bible study, we ought to study and get it right. Secondly, the fourth commandment is the only commandment not taught to be followed in the New Testament. All the other commandments are explicitly taught in the New Testament. Jesus doesn't, condemn the Sabbath. Jesus followed the Sabbath. He was a law-practicing Jew. He was the only man to ever actually live out the Mosaic law. That was part of him being the perfect and spotless lamb, that he had to do that. When Matthew chapter 5, when Jesus said, I did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. Plereu, that word fulfill, it means to bring to completion. Like you're filling up a cup, and once it hits the top, boom, it's filled and done. And so it's a word that actually means I'm going to complete it. Look, there's a house over there. It's not built all the way. I'm going to go and fulfill the project. I'm going to build the house, and once the house is done, it's done. And so Jesus had to follow the whole law because that's what he came to do, to fulfill it, to be the one and only person ever to actually complete and fulfill the Mosaic law, bringing the law to the end so that we could have the new covenant. Hebrews chapter 8, verse 13 says, backing up, in that he says, a new covenant, he has made the first obsolete. Now, what is being obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. And so, okay, I'm checking on someone posted something and it like disappeared faster than I could read it. So, it's Roman. There we go. Established creation. Thank you, Roman. It's my old roommate, good buddy from high school, for those who don't know Roman. All right, so there's that. Not taught in the New Testament, to be followed. It's the first day. It's always Saturday, though, so we can't change that. Now, here's some other things concerning this fourth commandment. Key verses we all should have down in our Bibles. You should write it down next to Exodus chapter 20, right? Is Colossians, actually, we'll start with Romans 14, 5 and 6. Okay, these are the key verses. When people like our friends from the Seventh-day Adventist Church, you know, there's actually quite a few Saturday meeting Christian churches. And so, you know, they bring up these questions. Well, Romans 14, verses 5 and 6, one person esteems one day above another. Another esteems every day alike. Let each be fully convinced in his own mind. He who observes the day observes it to the Lord. He who does not observe the day to the Lord, he does not observe it. Eats and drinks and goes on, right? At the end of the day, we're not bound. And this is what Paul's really just saying here is we're not bound and we're not forbidden. I've known lots of Christians who still chose, like, I'm still going to take Saturdays as a day of rest. Going to church on Sunday, but I'm going to still use Saturdays as a day of rest. Have a blast. That's the whole point. We're not bound to it and we're not forbidden from it. Now, in Colossians chapter 2, Galatians, Ephesians, there's Philippians. And there's Colossians. I found it. Colossians chapter 2, verses 16 and 17. It says, so let no one judge you in food or in drink in regarding a festival or a new moon or Sabbaths, which are a shadow of things to come, but the substances of Christ. Many of these things in the Old Testament, right? That's the whole point. They were there to be a picture of something that was coming. And we're told that Jesus is our Sabbath rest. We get our rest in Jesus. Now, so where to take the rest of this? In short, the Lord's Day, Sundays, is the day that has traditionally been the day of worship. And yet there is not a single rule or law in the Bible telling Christians what day they're supposed to worship on. And as odd and awkward as it might feel, if your pastor decided to start doing church on Tuesdays, right? There's nothing wrong with that. Doesn't match your work schedule very well. And people might think you're weird. So it might be awkward, but there's nothing saying what day we worship on. Now, the early church had a tradition. They started worshiping on Sundays, and that's been the tradition ever since. Some churches want to worship on Saturdays. Now, here's the issue with that. The issue, I'm going to say it's an issue, is that they have the liberty to do so. And there's nothing wrong with worshiping on a Saturday. Other than often those are the same churches that typically imply that everyone else should be doing it too. Now we have a problem because now we have people who are judging us for the day we're worshiping on. So we have an issue there. If they tell us, well, why don't you keep the fourth commandment? And so while doing evangelism with Enrique at the park, we started sharing with a Seventh-day Adventist. And, you know, we talk about, you know, the Lord and the law, and we didn't know he was a Seventh-day Adventist at first. And so doing kind of way of the master, Ray Comfort, you know, the commandments, and, you know, are you a good person? And so he asked us, well, then do you guys keep the fourth commandment? Why do we keep the 9 commandments but not keep the fourth? Now, if you were here for our introduction, you should know the answer to this. But if you weren't here for that first introduction we did on Exodus 20, when we started the 10 Commandments, yeah, you're in a pickle now. If you tell people that they're supposed to keep the 9 commandments but not keep the one, you've got a problem that you have to explain. But if you tell people, well, I don't keep any of the commandments, the 10 commandments, nor the 613. Bear with if you weren't there that day, because that's the Mosaic law. I'm actually not bound to the Mosaic law at all, because that's the law to the Jews, the Mosaic law. I'm part of the new covenant. Now, in the new covenant, many of the moral aspects of the law are repeated and taught to Christians to continue in doing. And those are what I follow. So when Jesus and the apostles say that fornication and adultery and sexual morality are wrong, I continue in those things. When they say that theft is wrong, that I'm doing it because of the New Testament, not because of the Old. Now, we've had this analogy. I used to live here, but now I live here. If I lived in Canada and murder was a crime, and I moved to America and murder is a crime, just because I don't murder doesn't mean I'm following Canadian law. There's just, they share some laws. And so the New Covenant and the Old Covenant, there's things that are shared, but you're not actually under the Old Covenant. And so that's where things are confusing, because if you say, well, I'm keeping 9 of the 10 commandments. No. The New Testament teaches us, if you try and keep the law, you are bound to keep the whole law. We get that in Galatians. We get that in Colossians. We get it multiple times. Romans, James, you break one, you're guilty of it all. So that's the point, is that if you can't pick and choose Old Testament laws, but the ones that are repeated in the New Testament, love of Christ, well, there we go. Now you know. So we're following the love of Christ, we're following Jesus, and we can learn from the Old Testament laws. Now, the Bible never differentiates the Old Testament law, the Mosaic law. There's nothing in the Bible that says moral law, ceremonial law, and the judicial law, you might say. But we can look at them and categorize them. So you can't just say, well, I keep the moral part of the Mosaic law. Because again, the Bible says either you're keeping it all or you're not. But, so again, like our wording can be different when we're trying to explain this to people who are kind of bent on keeping the law. But you can simply say, that yes, I follow the teachings of Jesus and the epistles from the apostles, and many of those things you'll find in the moral portions of the Mosaic law. And so when you think about it, is it a moral issue to steal? And I think deep down, we all know the answer to that. And is it a moral issue to covet? I think deep down, we know that's a hard issue right there. Is it a moral issue whether or not you shave the sides of your head? Because the Jews are told not to, and they grow their hair down real long. That doesn't seem like a moral issue, like it's going to affect my relationship with God. What about creating an idol? That might affect my relationship with God, right? What about whether or not I work on the 7th day of the week? And that can be tough for some people who've maybe kept Sabbath. But at the end of the day, you realize that if you're doing all things to the Lord and for the Lord, then those things shouldn't affect that relationship. It's not a moral, it's more of a ceremonial thing. For what it's worth, communion, something we as Christians do, that's ceremonial, right? It's a ceremonial thing we do. We have very few, but we do have ceremonial things that we do. Baptism is ceremonial. And so it's just worth noting that those aren't moral things, those are ceremonial things. Christians have very few, but we have our ceremonial commands, or things we were told to go and do, versus moral. And so same with the Old Testament. The penalties for sins in the Old Testament. This is a stoning one, this is a this. Those are all judicial. How to run their nation. So, things to consider. All right. There's the 4th commandment. I think we kind of covered it all, what it is, what it isn't, why we can rest on the 7th day, why we don't have to rest on the 7th day, and why no one else can tell us we have to rest on the 7th day. So, there you go. We'll probably knock out the rest of the commandments Monday, Tuesday. We'll see. So, hey, God bless you guys. Thanks for joining in. Romans put a Colossians 3:23. So he's got that one down there. Yeah. Thank you, Roman. And so, hey, you guys all take care. Love you all. And I'll see you guys around. Stay safe. It's slippery outside.